Welcome to this 21st FreeSpeak podcast in which we discuss all things media. I'm your host, Gwen Lister. Our topic today is how the media covers the scourge of gender-based violence, or GBV as it's known, in Namibia. And it's one of the most urgent problems we face as a country. I actually saw it referenced recently as a shadow pandemic, but I'm thinking it's the real pandemic. For COVID, there's at least a chance of a vaccine at some point in the future, if only this were possible for GBV offenders. We're experiencing a spiraling rate of violence against women and children in Namibia, and rapes alone in the 4 of our 14 regions is approaching 1,000 only since the start of this year. And that's just those that are reported. Many aren't. So recently, many women took to the streets in what were called #ShutItAllDown protests. Adding insult to injury, some of these young women were also targeted by police in that same demonstration. So today we want to look at whether media coverage is effective when it comes to GBV. Is it sensitive enough? Does it comply with ethical codes of conduct? And does it protect the rights of dignity, privacy, safety, among others? And can the media do more? To examine these and other issues, with me today are 2 powerful young women who were themselves involved in the protest. Activist, youth leader, speaker and student Bertha Tobias, and journalist Ndapewoshali Shapwanale, who was also detained by police while covering the protest. So welcome to you both, and thanks so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. So first off, let me start with Ndapewoshali. The Journalist Code of Conduct is really quite specific around issues of media reporting and GBV, and the need to prioritize first and foremost the safety of GBV survivors. Also, their best interest, sensitivity around these issues. We can't name children, for example, who've been abused or raped. Do you think there's compliance, generally speaking, in the Namibian media around these things, or can we do more?
I think if there's more that we can do is educating ourselves on what terminology to use, educating ourselves on being more sensitive, but basically looking at modern day. Because you look at in the past, what was considered rape, what was considered sexual assault, what was considered abuse. In the past, you won't really, maybe verbal abuse, emotional abuse would not be considered SGBV or GBV as such. But then now we need to look at things like, is this the reason why it leads to a physical abuse in the end, and then even to death in the end? So we can always educate ourselves more. And I mean, we have the Combating of the Immoral Practices Act. We're guided by that. And there we already know that what is it that we need to do? We can't mention a name of a minor. You can't mention a name of a victim. You can't mention a name of a survivor. Right. What is it that the law says about it? Because any act, any regulation, any law needs to be in line with the Constitution. So if the Combating of Immoral Practices Act is an act of Parliament, it needs to be in line with the Constitution. And the Constitution, what does it say? It says that the dignity of a person, human rights of a person needs to be protected. So we as the journalists can always look back, what are the changing times, and constantly educate ourselves. We cannot just rely on what has been on paper all these years and then say that, no, I'm doing it by the book. But if there has been an evolution, we must also evolve our minds then. I know that on a number of occasions, people came out to say that, no, but the media need to stop saying that the person had an unconsented or did not, the person had sexual intercourse with this person without their consent. But there is something that the readers also need to understand, is that rape is the rape itself, the crime is this. There's a description in the Criminal Procedure Act, for example. By law, there's a legal description of what a rape is, and it is not the place of a journalist to say that Peter raped Anna. If this person was convicted, if the perpetrator was convicted by a court of law, that yes, your action towards Anna is in actual effect rape, then only you can really tell the journalist to say that, no, call it rape. You can't call it that it's, say you had sexual intercourse with this person without their consent.
Yeah.
Yes, because the journalists on their side also, we also have to make sure that we keep safe, because unless it's like you're saying that someone killed someone, I can't go write as a journalist, Peter murdered Anna. I can't write that, because the court of law is the one that has to say that, no, it is in fact murder, it's culpable homicide, it's manslaughter, it's what. So that's the part that I think the readers also need to understand, that the journalists, when they use these words and maybe not come out and say that who raped who, is because they also need to keep themselves on the right side of the law, in terms of waiting for the court to pronounce themselves.
Right, so be sensitive at the same time as we call something a spade.
Yes.
Call a spade a spade. Bertha, let me turn to you on that. You know, I've seen it referred to in Namibia, this GBV pandemic, as mass rape. And, you know, I don't think that's far off the truth, because, I mean, the statistics are just incredible. And it impacts, let's not forget, not only women, but also most critically children as well. It's just really bad. So, in your opinion, how do we do justice to the seriousness of this problem in Namibia, while at the same time having to be, as Ndapewoshali's just said now, be sensitive to the rights of victims? So, you know, at some point, especially in media or as a journalist, you may find yourself being caught in the middle, where you really want to show your readers and inform people how bad it is. At the same time, you have to be very sensitive about the rights on all sides. What do you think from this perspective? Can we do more? Yeah. Maybe I could quickly just tell you, somebody this morning just said to me, you know, over the weekend, Blommy will know, we have what is called the police report, where they will give us reports on what happened over the weekend. And this person said to me, sometimes it's like reading the weather report, because you just say a child of 3 was raped in Umbalantu, but it doesn't give the systemic reasons for why and how these things are happening. So what are your thoughts around this, Bertha?
Right. So I think the first thing, and I think this is something that we're all, it's exactly what you're speaking to, right? So when we say, for example, a child of 3 was raped in Umbalantu, there's an aspect of clinicality and insensitivity that exists in a statement like that. But it's an insensitivity that is almost, I think it's a collective attempt to distance ourselves from how difficult it might be to stomach and or digest, were we to communicate everything in their fullness and in their true accurate magnitude, because I don't think we can genuinely claim to be okay. I think it would have an impact on our psyche if we had to digest each and every single kind of case of sexual and gender-based violence. But speaking to mass rape, I think that's it's an accurate term to use. And I think we'd have to look at the impact of mass anything really. So I think when SGBV and femicide continues to persist in Namibia, it does something for us collectively. It seeps into the fabric of how we exist as a society. It creates fractures. It creates perceptions of men, for example, or of SGBV perpetrators, but it definitely has manifestations that we are only going to see later, because what we have, for example, now is a monster on our hands that has gotten out of control. We don't know how to fix it, so now we are all in a collective frenzy where we're running around trying to pinpoint exactly where it came from. And the same way that we can't pinpoint that is how right now what is happening now is definitely going to manifest when we grow up and we have our own children, in the way we perceive each other. But I also think that the why I think the term mass rape, for example, is accurate is because it speaks to how violent Namibia really is. And there's something that is constant. We constantly talk about this. As a post-conflict society, there's a characteristic of violence. And when you couple violence with harmful and problematic perceptions of women, you have what we have on our hands now. So I think that's really what's happening. But I think how that can be dealt with is what we've done with #ShutItAllDown. And it's what civil society organizations and journalists are doing, which is using their platforms to contribute to those conversations and to hold government and to hold other institutions accountable. And I think this is where we'd have to look at, for example, what South Africa's done. So I think they've done two things very well. So one, it is communicating that they've elevated the crisis of SGB and femicide to top leadership level, where their president has said, we're going to do something about this and this is what we're doing. So to the more technical, pragmatic bits, like, extending sexual offenses to just sexual intimidation, and extending the responsibility of anybody who witnesses a sexual crime committed against a child, where it becomes it is illegal to watch a child undergo a sexual crime and not report it. Yeah. So I think all of that, those are policy kind of administrative manifestations of how seriously South Africa has started to take their SGBV crisis. And I think until we get to that stage where we understand that we have a national crisis, until we get to a stage where we don't radicalize the conversation, I think we'll continue to go around in circles, have formal engagements, and this is something we're going to touch on later when we talk about the consultation, right? So if we don't radicalize it, we are going to go around in circles, and our children will be having this conversation.
I think some very good points there, Bertha. Also, Ndapewoshali, I often think, we go to, and I think generally speaking, as you've indicated, the media is fairly sensitive about protecting rape victims or victims of abuse, whether they be women or children. But at the same time, it often bothers me that in the process of protecting them, we are often protecting the very perpetrators. Because often you will find that these are familial crimes that are happening. And as these happen, you cannot mention the name of the uncle or the father or the brother who abused a child or a woman, seen in the light of what the Shut It All Down protesters demanded, which is a sex offenders register. How do you think, would something like that actually go a long way towards naming and shaming? Do you think that will help us in any way deal with this curse?
Yeah. When there was a time, I think on social media, most predominantly on Twitter, where there was a whole, I think it was the Me Too movement basically, where where girls came out and women came out and said that, listen, I was raped by who. Listen, ABCD raped me. I was sexually harassed by this person, and I was sexually harassed by this person, and people came out and people spoke, and it was beautiful to see, because not only some people spoke about incidences that happened 4-5 years ago, and to carry that burden all those years, that is an injustice to people themselves in a country that prides itself in one of the best justice systems. It speaks to why is it that this person is walking around with this on their shoulders? Why can they not trust the process in making sure that whoever did this wrong to them can be brought to book? Just soon after that, Gwen, then came out apologies, where some of the women, the ladies, the girls who said that I was raped by who, no, I was sexually abused by who, came out and apologized. We hear of people went to lawyers and they said that no, this was actually not an incident. Some of the incidences came out where people actually said that no, but we were together that night and this is actually what happened. The person is lying. And that is so problematic, because I was very angry when that happened, Gwen, because the fact that, and it's again, for us, it's impossible to say that something like that where people come out and say, this happened to me, that you won't have the one or two people who would want to take advantage of that and then just, have a negative energy towards it, take advantage and actually come out and lie. It happens everywhere, even in religion it happens, where you have pastors who are really preaching the word of God. The Bible says that many will come, false prophets will come in my name. So you have those people who came with that. The problem with these people, and I think it's a selfish act to want to take advantage of something like that, is that they are taking away from in this case, the Me Too movement, where someone really, this was the one opportunity to really speak out and have some sort of justice for the injustice that happened to them. Now, when it comes to the call for a sex offenders register, I advocate for name and shaming. I definitely advocate for it in any and everything. And especially when it comes to something like this, because I think that it is one approach that where men will, before they'll think twice or 3 times or 4 times before. I think that the whole sex offenders register is a name and shame. And that would, even if it's just 5 or 6 people, men, will think twice that I don't want my name to appear there. So then let me rather not even push things or whatever. Gwen, there is just, and I think this is a very fair concern, is that who else will be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who will take advantage of this, and then who will come out and actually lie about what happened to them, and then cast this entire doubt on the whole register. That is my main concern. I think that in a perfect world, I would really love for a sex offenders register to exist. How do we safeguard that the doubt is not cast? Because the danger in is that because you're doubting these 2 people, everybody else. And then you find someone who's been sitting with this, who was probably a rape victim because we found out the other day that people are sitting around having been raped multiple times by family members, by friends, by strangers, but they could never come out.
Exactly.
And now they have this.
There hasn't been a conviction, obviously the register would need to be convicted.
It must be convictions.
Offenders.
It must be convicted offenders. Then again, you have now the whole. How long does it take for a conviction when it comes to sexual offense? And I think in Namibia we know that it takes forever. It takes forever. So it's a brilliant idea, and I think in a perfect world, if it could work perfect by the book, like it would work theory-wise, it would be a positive. But then there are so many things around the sex offenders register that first need to be taken care of, that first need to be dealt with in order for this not to one day, 20 years later, be a thing of no, we have to shut the sex offenders register down because who had a personal vendetta against someone, and then they just decided around this. And then also that it took 5-10 years for this person to get an offender to be convicted. I remember also when there was also again something else happening on Twitter, and one of the ladies said that she was raped by a police officer. It's 7 years later, the case is thrown out, it didn't go anywhere. So that's something, it's not just the register is there, enter the names. Absolutely. There's a lot of work around it. Society, legislature, the justice system that needs to first be taken care of before we can even start thinking about, again, a sex offenders register can exist. But an effective sex offenders register, one that, what is the purpose of this register?
Exactly.
For it to carry that out.
What do we want? And that's maybe, let me refer that to Bertha. It sounds good, doesn't it? To put those names out there, name and shame them, a sexual offenders register, pedophiles, whatever. It sounds nice to do it, but what do we actually want to achieve with that? Do we want them to be ostracized from society? Do we want them not to have jobs, for their potential future partners or whatever to be aware? And will this register really help us address what is a systemic root cause thing happening in society? Will it help us to tackle this moral degradation, if you like, that we're undergoing as a society at the moment?
Right.
Bertha, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, right. So 2 things, right, that I think are also very important to add on to when we're talking about, because I completely agree with Ndapewoshali that there's so much work that needs to go into it. On top of everything that she's mentioned, there's also the possible and or potential retraining of an entire division of the police to make sure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands. There's also the conversation of who is it going to be accessible to, and how do we make sure that information is not leaked out, because you can't, it's probably not the best or the wisest to make it accessible to the public, because that leads to other things like mob justice, like people taking the law into their own hands. And I think that's where the media comes in, actually, where it's very, I think the media has a consequential role in shaping how a society views perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence. So the more we kind of report on them as monsters or as people who deserve to be ostracized, the deeper the divide that is going to be created, and as such, the greater the potential for society to take kind of that justice into their own hands.
Absolutely.
So that's one
Good
thing.
point.
Yeah, and then just last thing as well, I think the main kind of function, or at least what was in the official petition, is that we would like that to be accessible to bodies that are dealing with primarily women and children. So we don't have cases, for example, of, people who are sex offenders who are going to work in special schools and taking advantage of learners who can't speak, for example. But I think it's what you're saying, Ndapewoshali, which is it can exist in a perfect society. But I guess given the capacity challenges that we're already facing with just regular training of law enforcement, regular implementation of information dissemination, we have a long way to go. Yeah.
Some good points there as well. Ndapewoshali, maybe let's talk about the power of the image, especially when it comes to survivors, let's use that word rather than victims of rape and abuse. If I think about the Shut It All Down protest, there was some incredibly powerful images there depicting women as empowered and in control, and it was wonderful to see. On the other hand, obviously the media makes use of images that show beaten and bloodied women who are subject to that abuse. What are your thoughts around this image? Obviously, we don't want to feed into the perception that women are victims. Yeah. At the same time, you want to show things the way they really are and show people the horror of rape and domestic abuse or whatever. What are your thoughts? Can we strike a happy medium or a balance around that in the media?
Definitely, Gwen. I think the picture around sexual gender-based violence, rape, has always been the woman is the victim. And again, I think that's also why the wording has also changed now to survivor. And that the minute you think about a rape victim, you think about this woman is powerless, this woman is... And I think that's also one of the problematic things, even with the pictures also. Even if it's a picture that, if you see the pictures that are used by the media, just recently now the Namibian posted a picture on Twitter saying, I think it was from the police report, where they reported on a rape. It was basically a woman sitting down, her arm being, or the man's arm being grabbed. And it's always the woman is in a position of not having power. And that has also been very problematic in the fact that it has painted this image that if you're a victim of rape or SGBV, it's because you are either weak or you are vulnerable. Women, of course, someone is taking advantage of your physical, like you're physically not as strong as they are, but then that also has then ripple effects on, am I going to go and report? If I'm in a relationship with my boyfriend, I'm well off, I'm educated, I'm again a demographic that we don't speak to, or that the imaging of sexual of SGBV and GBV and rape does not speak to, is that demographic of I drive my dream car, I have my dream occupation and everything. So the imaging is very important. The same way we will not forget that, yes, women are taken advantage of, and this is a bad thing that happens to them. The imaging of I am a survivor, or this powerful imaging is also very much necessary, so that the woman can be motivated to say that, listen, it doesn't mean because you fell victim to, or this happened to you, this man did this to you, or this person did this to you, that you are weak, that you are, again, that victim mentality. So you can go report it. It has a ripple effect on that. So I think there needs to be a balance. We need to strike a balance between putting out there to say that, yes, when women fall victim to this is what happens to them. They are beaten, they killed, men take advantage of the fact that they are maybe physically smaller. But we also have to push that image to say that the fact that you can, it doesn't take away from the strength or the powerful woman that you are if this happens to you. So you need to go out and you need to report it, you need to speak against it, you need to highlight it. And the minute we are able to use that image to say that, the strong image to say that I'm speaking against this, the strong image to say that you are not, even if I was, I'm a survivor, it was not my fault, and it doesn't make me a weakling. I am, the fact that I can actually go and report this or speak against this, be a survivor and still speak against this, speaks power. And that is why it's so important to strike a balance between the two. There's the other image has traditionally, it exists. But I think we've evolved now to say that, okay, since this image of power has not existed, the power that lies in that you can speak out, you can report, and you can seek justice against the injustice that happened against you. That image is very important. And as the media, I think we need to be intentional about painting that picture. We need to be or not painting the picture, but using that image if that image is available. We need to be intentional about not only going to find the story, because when you do these stories, you want to speak to the victim and you want to ask the victim, what is it that went through you? What is the pain? Describe the pain for me. But we also need to seek the image that says that you have survived this. So what is you've overcome this? What is the power in this? Because that image needs to be put out there to encourage. And I think that is what's also going to help with actually dealing with this, with having people actually come out and say, this has happened to me.
Other women,
and other women to say that, yes, I can be in this demographic of people. And it's not that I'm weak or less or not as successful or powerful as I think I am, that this has happened to me.
And not be shamed.
And
because
not be
it's
shamed.
Not my fault.
It's not my fault.
Happened.
I am not weak. I'm not this little. I'm still the powerful woman who walks into a boardroom and still commands leadership or whatever. And this can still happen to me. I'm not that rape, and what is not just for that person.
Right.
And then
it's not how I want to be identified.
So
also.
that will assist in actually dealing with it from a root already.
Okay.
Because in order for you
maybe that's what I want to get to, Ndapewoshali, is exactly that root. And I mean, Bertha's already just referred to the issue about colonialism and the very deep divisions that it has caused in Namibia, among others, things like contract labor, separating families, and fathers being away from mothers and starting second families. So it's very complex. The causes of, or what we think are the causes of this systemic violence. Also, of course, cultural practices, Bertha, that's what I wanted to ask you. To what extent do you think these, because often we talk about culture with a great deal of pride, but there are often aspects of all the various cultures which are actually don't belong in the modern day with human rights and so on. What do you think, to what extent does this impact on what is happening in Namibia today, and do we need to look deeper?
Right.
Definitely. At the heart of the problem, in other words. Yeah.
Definitely, I think so. And I think what makes the conversation about culture so tricky is that people obviously attach a great deal of sanctity and honor and, ancestral kind of thinking to it, which means that anytime you suggest that something needs to be reviewed or a particular cultural practice needs to be reevaluated, people take it as a direct attack on their cultural, community, collective existence, or whatever term we want to use. But I believe, and this is a conversation I was having with a friend the other day, where they said, we can't just abandon our cultural practices. I think if a particular cultural practice is rooted in dehumanizing women, for example,
Absolutely.
then that is an aspect of culture that you need to revisit.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then it becomes important to clarify that when we say no, abolish Olufuko, we are not saying abolish Oshiwambo culture.
No,
We're
exactly.
saying that particular practice is incorrect, where you are grooming 12-year-old girls for marriage, and you are teaching them that men can just come and choose, and that's, that they're functional reproductive units. That's not okay. And that doesn't mean that I'm effectively disregarding the cultural practices of an entire Oshiwambo community, for example, but it means that we are recognizing that culture in itself is a recognition of a community's capacity for social transformation and to move forward and to evolve in ways that are self-fulfilling and self-actualizing for all the individuals in that particular community. That's what makes culture in the first place.
Absolutely.
Is the ability to evolve. So that's the point of access to information. So now if we have access to information and we're able to recognize and come together and say that's incorrect, female genital mutilation is dehumanizing.
Absolutely.
Wife beating or beating out of love, if he doesn't beat me, he doesn't love me,
Passion
is incorrect.
Is
exactly.
Wrong. Exactly.
Testing someone for sexual readiness is incorrect. Widow inheritance is incorrect. These are all parts that are deeply dehumanizing, and they're rooted in degrading women, and those are the aspects that we need to shut down. And I constantly say that for me, so I'm 20 years old. So when I think about my family and building a house one day, if and when I do decide to, those are parts of culture that I'm disregarding.
Absolutely.
And I don't feel guilty about doing that. And in fact, it makes me think about how so many of these aspects of quote unquote culture manifest even, to the demographics that we don't think they would kind of manifest to. They deeply deeply influence the dynamics of a household, whether you're living in a pretty mansion in Ludwigsdorf
or in the village.
Or in the village.
Exactly.
There's manifestations of that constantly. And I always say, for example, with the hashtag Shut It All Down protests, that's where my family sexism, for example, started showing, where aunts would call and they'd say, tell her why she's shouting at government officials on television.
Right, exactly.
She's a girl who's going to
Exactly.
marry her. She's so loud.
Yes.
So all of that,
Yeah.
and you think you're doing it, out of the goodness of your heart, but that's all a cultural, it's all deeply rooted in Oshiwambo culture, for example, or African indigenous practices that tell us, no, sit down, sweep like a girl, bend down, and shrink
Exactly.
yourself, be timid, be
And
reserved.
those are aspects of culture in different cultures that most women have to overcome. Because
Exactly.
I think it's pretty much across the board. It's not just Oshiwambo culture where women's place is kind of, to keep quiet and be polite.
It's a universal kind of cultural principle almost. And I think with that, really, it's revisit those parts of culture, review and reevaluate. And it's not to say that we're disregarding culture. And I think it's that safety and that security of saying, but this is my cultural practice, that gives people the right or the feeling of, security in committing acts of sexual violence.
Absolutely.
Because you feel you need to discipline your wife, and you're validated by something as long-standing as culture, and something as almost collectively agreed upon as culture. So I think until we have the very uncomfortable conversation that there's certain things that we're engaging in, like child marriage, that should not be happening, then we're not going to move forward.
And there was also a lot of debate recently on Twitter about Oshierero culture in that regard.
Exactly.
So there's a lot.
I'd just like to add as well. And I think culture can also mean different things, right? And I think for me, it's been beautiful to witness an almost social cultural evaluation of sorts, particularly pertaining to the way women express themselves and the way women exist with their bodies and just with their existence as women. And that is, it came out strongly when young people were playing WAP. WAP.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, when we were playing WAP at the protests. Or most recently where Lioness hosted Hovember at Brewers Market.
Yes.
So all of these things, I think, speak to some kind of evolution, or at least in a particular group, where young women particularly are becoming a lot more expressive. And that's a much more explicit confrontation of culture. It makes people a lot more uncomfortable. We had Slut Shame Walk. I think that deeply influenced or affected or contributed to, in some way, the social-political landscape of perceptions of women's bodies. So that is already a contribution to culture.
The other thing is, though, just to briefly say, I think that's essential, but I think it needs to be explained better to people. Yeah. Because in a sense, it's happening in this more sophisticated environment on Twitter, and other people out there are not so sure what the heck is the slut shame walk about, or the men are trash hashtag. How do we really need to do, I think, more explaining for people to understand. But Ndapewoshali, let me interrupt you there, because I'm getting signs that I think we're running out of time. The conversation is so fascinating. So can I quickly keep that thought? And just the last couple of points I want from each of you, maybe just to, particularly for Bertha, Shut It All Down got a lot of attention, a lot of support, even from outside the borders of Namibia. But following the consultations with the president, things have kind of died down a bit. So I'd like just to hear from you if things have petered out or they're going to pop up again. Ndapewoshali, perhaps to you, the issue of the very fine line between journalism and activism. As you know, State House Press Secretary recently tweeted that journalists should not be activists, irrespective of the cause they claim to defend. So a little bit on you, from you on those 2 points, and then finally, from the two of you, both of you, just 3 issues which you feel, and I think you raised some important things that South Africa is doing, for example, Bertha, 3 things that we can do sort of right now to try and help stem the tide in the violence, and the same from you, if possible, Ndapewoshali.
Journalism in itself, Gwen, has an element of activism. The decision to do a certain story in itself. Journalism, let me start off by because you made reference to what the press secretary, that very unfortunate statement there, or retweet or whatever they buy, or quote, which again, that comment was taken out of context, because I went back and I listened to what the gentleman actually said, and it was taken totally out of context. You need to understand that an activist an activism. Element of activism. I say this, that journalism in itself has an element of activism. The fact that you decide to seek the truth, because what is it that you're doing? You need to be objective, not to be neutral, because if you're being neutral, it's like I'm taking what you're saying, even though I know that it's a lie. I'm taking what you're saying and I'm taking what you're saying, and that's not. You're not seeking the truth. You're trying to be neutral.
Exactly.
You need to be objective in seeking the truth. And seeking truth in itself, that is activism. Because what are you doing? Bertha she's an activist for GBV. Journalist, you're an activist for seeking the truth. So it's absolutely far-fetched. It's absolute hogwash, if I have to say that. If you're going to want to separate activism from journalism, Gwen, the work that you did pre-independence with the Namibian and the entire Namibian team played a major role. The reason why the South Africans burned down or bombed the Namibian newspaper is because they knew that you're doing something for the liberation of Namibia. That is activism. So it is very far-fetched to say that journalism needs to exist separate from activism.
Yeah.
It is far-fetched. What I want to say is in reference to the shut it all down movement. I was at the movement. I did not chant once, nor did I ever tweet or anything about shut it all down, because I knew that I'm going to cover the story. I'm going to write the story for AFP and Reuters. That is me removing myself from it.
Correct. Even though you may support the cause, you weren't part of it.
Yes, I will never say it. I will never say I'm supporting the cause. I've never used the hashtag shut it all down, because I need to be objective. And my objectivity cannot be in any way shadowed by, but she tweeted about this, so she's leaning towards that. I cannot do that. And that is why, and I'm seeking the truth, which would be the comments from government, the comments from the demonstrators, and so on. The biggest mistake that was made, Gwen, and again, the people who were arrested and they said that they're journalists. If we're being very honest with ourselves, they're not practicing. They're not journalists, because if you there and then you can't be there. You're shouting, shut it all down, chanting, and then when you get arrested, no, you pull out your media card. You go there deciding, am I going there as a demonstrator, or am I wearing my journalism hat? Your activism comes in when you use your platform as a reporter to say that this is happening in my country, I'm going to write about this. That is why the element of, you cannot say that journalism needs to exist without the element of journalists. And it's also wrong to say that the element of activism in journalism is propaganda. It's not.
No, it's not.
It can never be propaganda, because the fact that you decide to do that story in the first place, because I could have decided that day that no, there is a pipeline.
You could have ignored the whole demonstration.
A pipe burst somewhere else. I'm going to cover that story.
Correct.
But my decision to say that the world needs to hear, through my platform where I write to, the world needs to hear about what's happening in Namibia. That is my element of activism in journalism. The only thing that we need to make sure that we keep ourselves safe from in order to preserve the quality of journalism is to know that when you go there, you draw the line. Am I going there as a demonstrator? Am I going there as a journalist covering it? Your activism does not only start with you chanting or saying I fully support the movement, or big ups or high five to that. Your activism is your decision to do the story in the first place.
To avoid a conflict of
yes,
interest. This
very,
is
very
where
much.
It comes down to.
Very, very much.
Yeah.
And I want this needs to come out very strongly to each and every journalist, Gwen, that we need to safeguard our duty as journalists so that it's not questioned, in making sure that we don't cross the line. Our objectivity is not questioned, and that our conflict, our interests are not questioned. If you are very passionately involved, or you're very passionate about something, then rather not cover it. I did it with the killings of the family by the Botswana Defence Force. I was very vocal about it. I was bombarding the press secretary with his comments about it's pointless to march. I was very vocal about it, but I did not write about it once, because I was involved in it. My activism with regards to the shut it all down was my decision And that's not shut it all down, but that's GBV. Right. The same thing when journalists cover corruption. We can decide to go write about people putting up a Christmas tree, but the fact that you're writing about corruption, your activism is in that you don't want your nation to suffer. So you're seeking the truth. You're seeking the truth, and that seeking the truth is activism in journalism. You cannot say journalism exists without activism, or activism should not exist in journalism.
Thanks, Blom. You've put that very well. Last 3 points from you. What do you think we can do right now to try and stem the tide of GBV, whether it's through the media or
through the media?
What will be effective?
The media, the role that the media needs to play is be active in teach unlearning, in the unlearning process. Unlearning process in the holding government accountable, justice system accountable in the process it takes. For example, it should not be the journalists or media or journalism should make it a point to put it out there. It should not be okay that somebody has to go through a rape case for 7 years.
7 years, no.
7 years, no conviction. So it's we need to be
justice
active.
Delayed is justice denied.
Justice delayed is justice denied, right. Especially in something like this. So it's unlearning. We need to be active, actively involved in the unlearning of, like Bertha said, the cultural practices. Like Bertha said, what things that are okay, in the past were okay. Certain statements that were made, they're not. Certain statements that were made. For example, if someone comes and says that my boss continuously touches my thigh, you need to, in the past you would say, yeah, but you are just one case. But now as a journalist, you need to think to yourself that, is it worth a story that I need to now actually go and see and interview all other female employees in this company and say, what has that been, and do a story about that, or do I just brush it off? That is the process of unlearning. That is the process of saying that that is not okay. So we need to be actively involved in that, in the unlearning. We need to be actively involved in actually holding government, because remember, we're the fourth estate. We're holding government accountable. And especially in the judiciary legislature part, we need to be actively involved in that. And then also just educating ourselves as the media in how we report on this, terminology, new ways of reporting on this. Do we just wait for the police report to come out and then we report on that? Or do we actually,
story,
or do we actually go in and say that I'm doing an investigative story on GBV in this community? I'm doing that. So that, I think, from a journalistic part is the 3 points I think we can do to contribute to fighting GBV.
Some very good points there. Thanks very much. Bertha, can I turn to you and a little bit about where you think Shut It All Down is heading, and then your 3 points, 3 things you think we can do.
Right. So the first thing, I think it's important that you ask, it seems like the energy has died out. And I think that's really the nature of any kind of sporadic, spontaneous movement where the climax is already at the beginning. So really, the only way to go is down
and
from there in terms of energy.
To whip it all up again.
Exactly, especially because it was kind of founded in a spark. I mean, yes, there was the accumulated gradual anger of SGBV cases, but it was really the discovery of the human remains.
Absolutely.
Where, so I think that is kind of reflective of, or generally symptomatic of, any kind of sporadic movement, particularly a movement that is headed by young people, right? Just because of the I guess the kind of energy that we generally tend to exhibit. Right. So I think right now with #ShutItAllDown, it's in the kind of tedious administrative work of formal engagements, of drawing up budgets, of coming up with initiatives and outsourcing and trying to call everybody and say, okay, what are you doing? Oh no, I have school, I'm a full-time student. So I think that's really where we're at, is a matter of self-mobilization. But I also think it's important to recognize that because from the get-go we're pushing that it's a faceless and or leaderless movement.
Right, so you don't want to
it's
orchestrate it, in other words.
Yes, it's that, and also that means that right now there's a space where there's very little coordination, because you can't hold a single individual accountable for things not happening. Right. So we could walk up to anybody who was at the protest and say, hey, we're shut it all down right now. So I think that kind of distancing, either for protecting yourself individually, whether it's employability or respectability politics, is also kind of, I guess, damaging the movement in that way, which is it's very unfortunate as well. But I think that's also where it's important to recognize that it was never the responsibility of young people to kind of solve SGBV in the country.
Certainly,
and that's something that personally, and I think lots of other young people maybe speaking under correction, can echo is the frustration that comes when, you walk up to, I guess, an official or somebody who works with a civil society organization, and you say, this is what we think, or this is us holding you accountable, and they say, well, what have you been doing about it in the past? Well, I was in high school the past 3 years, so I don't know, that's your job.
Right.
So I think that kind of detachment is why the energy is petering out, and I think it's going to take another spark.
And if I may say, you don't have to always take to the streets. Let's face it, in between those occasions is an ongoing campaign.
Definitely.
Where your young voices you should make them heard, whether it's through a podcast like this or writing an opinion piece in the paper, and here the media comes back in again to amplify those voices and keep them going.
Exactly.
And not just let there be a lull until the next time something really
huge and dramatic
has happened, because it's happening every day. Women are living with this problem, and so are the kids.
Exactly.
And it's a shame.
Exactly. And then I guess the final three things, I think one, Ndapewoshali has already echoed, it's actively unlearning and everybody participating in that. Mm-hmm. The second thing, I think, for me is a much more prioritization from leadership and communication that we're in a crisis and that we're in an emergency. And I think that was really the philosophy, obviously, of Shut It All Down, is to say, why should we care about the economy if we can't be alive to witness the economy prosper? And then the last thing I think that we can all do collectively is understand that we're not fighting each other. Because I think if there's something we've learned from Shut It All Down, is, instead of kind of helping, we've had people say, well, why are you calling for a state of emergency? It doesn't make any sense. Well, then tell us what does make sense. So I think, understanding that it's not about fighting each other, it's not about demonstrating who has the more sophisticated way of solving SGBV. We're all confused. We're all desperate for a solution. We're all desperate to see change. So I think once we can just recognize that, you have people saying, yeah, you're just talking about GBV. You're not talking about, environmentalism. And it's like, well, use your platform. So I think understanding that everybody should use what they have at their disposal to contribute to fighting against SGBV, and that we're not fighting each other, especially not young people. I think that it will get us much further, much faster when we stop trying to kind of
compartmentalize
assess. Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I just wanted to end with, by thanking both of you so much for a fascinating discussion. We could talk for hours, I know, but just to finally say, this is about human rights, about women's rights, about children's rights. It's not political. It's not about taking on government, even though you may call for the resignation of a minister or ask the Justice Department to create a sex offenders register. This is about everyone, and more particularly all women and all children who are touched in any way by this violence that has just become unconscionable. It's really come to a point we can't accept it anymore. So I think it's a fight that everyone needs to join, and as you say, not pick on each other at the end of the day, but try and support this and try and work in those communities throughout. I mean, from the most sophisticated, richest homes in Ludwigsdorf, it's happening there as much as it is in the villages and townships of the north and other parts of the country. So both of you, thank you so much. We haven't solved the problem, but maybe we've got a little way along to actually trying to identify some of the key priorities and tasks we need to tackle ahead. Thank you both.
Thank you, Gwen.